Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for attending the session. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very sorry not to be in Sardinia in person. There are no words to express how sorry I am not to be there. Unfortunately, the weather in London, well, in the UK, the storm here had different plans for me. So uh, I get the benefit to give a talk, but I don't get the benefit of being in beautiful Sardinia. Um, um, Also, that means that I haven't actually attended previous sessions, but I gather from the program that uh, there, there is a little bit of overlap between some of the sessions and keynotes. So forgive me if I don't make the right kind of connections that I would have been able to make had I been with you in person. So what I want to do today is to talk about AI in education in the context of supporting competencies, which are sometimes referred to as kind of soft competencies or soft skills, for better or for worse, rightly or wrongly. And these are competencies which relate to learners' social and emotional self-regulation. And what I want to do is to actually bring these competencies in the broader discussion around how technology can be used to support these kinds of competencies, and in particular how AI enhanced learning environments can be designed to tap into those competencies, to scaffold those competencies, and what we can learn from that. So since we're talking about AI, since I'm using the term AI straight away, I wanted to begin by giving you a definition of AI, which I am working with throughout my research. And I think it's really important to begin with a definition, because there is a lot of confusion at the moment. It's a very loaded term. Very often, what I hear in terms of the definition of AI is either a very high level definition, which is very difficult to kind of contextualize in concrete terms, or it is equated very often with machine learning, which is also not very helpful because it misses a whole part of AI research, which is in particular relevant to education. And so I kind of apply this, or utilize this definition that goes back to the origins of the AI field, which has broadly three dimensions. The first dimension, which is, I think, quite fundamental, is AI as applied philosophy, which allows us to formulate fundamental questions about what is intelligence and what is learning, in fact. And if we go back to 1956, that college learning figured very prominently in the first use of the word artificial intelligence. The second dimension, which is really critical, and it's a very critical dimension in the context of AI in education, is AI as a methodology or as a method. And a lot of you will be familiar, I think, with AI being used predominantly to model human cognitive processes in order to understand them better, and in order to inform our theories of learning, to interact with the learning sciences, and to enhance our general understanding of how humans learn. And then the final dimension is AI as a solution, which is something which is receiving increasing attention right now, because there have been some quite substantial advances, especially in machine learning recently, which make it possible to take AI out of the lab, which where it has been for the past 40 plus years, into the mainstream of our lives and systems. So I think it's really important to have these three dimensions in mind when we're talking about AI in education, because sometimes we can get ahead of ourselves and think about the solution before we actually understand the questions and before we understand some of the possible answers to those questions. Now, in terms of the AI in education and the challenges that AI in education has tried to address, it has very much resided within those three dimensions, if you like, of the definition of AI, but it has been driven very much by this challenge of finding a solution to this aspiration of scaling up best educational practices, and key motivation, which I believe was already introduced in the previous talk, is this 2 sigma effect challenge, which was introduced by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues, where they have provided some quite compelling evidence that one-to-one tutoring is in general better than classroom instruction. This has really kind of motivated the field of AI in education over the past 30, 40 years. And the idea here being that, if we can actually reproduce some of these best educational practices, if we can scale up the one-to-one tutoring, which has been found to lead to much better, significantly better learning outcomes for students, then we will be really contributing to spreading the education and good education across cultural, geographical spaces, and making it available to more people. So the idea here is that we move from traditional classroom instruction to perhaps individual tuition, to then scaling up this individual tuition, which we know is very expensive. It's not feasible to do at scale in traditional ways, through the introduction of technology, ideally intelligent tutoring systems. So continuing with this idea, the ambition here and the aspiration here is to deliver education to anyone, anytime, and anywhere, focusing on scale, but also staying within the best practices of supporting and fostering autonomy and the ability of learners to generate knowledge and generate skills in a lifelong manner. So if we go back to this triangle of AI definition, we can start seeing how these different elements might be actually, or at least there are questions around how these three elements, the applied philosophy, the methodology, and the solution within this definition, may actually help us achieve the scale, but also keep this focus on the individual learner. So this is all good, and there has been quite a bit of success in AI in education. Certainly, we have gained quite a lot of knowledge through our computational modeling efforts, and there are some working solutions out there. For example, the cognitive tutors which are quite popular. They are quite they especially popular in the States, and the work is continuing to see how we can embed those systems in everyday educational practices. But there is a flip side to this whole ambition, and especially this is becoming an issue with the recognition of the kind of dangers that AI is introducing in the mainstream of our lives, because we are dealing predominantly with what I would call half-baked solutions, which we take out of the labs, and we're working with prototypes that we kind of are in danger also of reinforcing this kind of notion of efficient education, whatever that means. This is actually one of my favorite cartoons from the turn of the 19th and 20th century, which has this kind of vision of the education of the future, where every learner is supported with individual tuition, although this vision is also quite terrifying if you look to the right-hand side of the slide. I think it's right-hand side. I don't know which side it is for you, actually, with the teacher kind of putting the books into the mincing machine, and feeding knowledge or information, perhaps more likely to the students. And there is also a danger that we are going to over-measure things and try to fit learners into some sort of one measure fits all kind of scenario. And we do see that also in some of the AI ed work in relation to tutoring systems. There is definitely a predominant focus on well-defined domains, on subject domains, on traditional kind of classroom challenges. But what I want to talk about, so this is a preamble, a long preamble to what I want to talk about, because what I want to talk about is a set of opportunities, as I said at the very beginning at the outset of my talk. What I want to talk about are the opportunities in relation to different kinds of skills which are traditionally actually quite difficult to support in the classroom, but also only recently becoming part of they kind of only recently came on the horizon within the AI in education field. These skills are related to self-regulation and more broadly metacognition. So the first thing that I want to talk about, so I will use actually examples from my own research from a couple of projects which focused on supporting young children and also young people, adolescents and young adults, in acquiring and practicing exercising social interaction skills and self-reflection. And the first project that I would like to talk about is I think about this project as a way of demonstrating how technology can be used as a stepping stone to connecting, to helping children connect with the kind of real world, within the real world interactions. And this is a project which took place in the context of autism. And here there is a very interesting aspect of autism interventions, which relates back to this idea of one size fits all, and the danger that we may actually use technology to reinforce existing systems which don't necessarily work very well. rather than actually stepping out, helping us rethink the way that we support learners and rethink the way that we deliver educational support. So in autism interventions, there is a kind of a predominance of approaches, which, and I think it is fair to say that they are still predominant approaches. There is which try to fit the learner to the environment, rather than creating environments in which learners can demonstrate their strengths in order to build on them. These are models, these are interventions which are based very much on medical kind of diagnostic approaches, which emphasize a model of deficit. And in fact, if we look at the history also of AI in education, that model of deficit is even present in the vocabulary that is being used, for example, when we model learners interacting with technology. And we call that modeling process, we use the term diagnostic. So we diagnose misconceptions, for example, or we diagnose behaviors which are lacking in some way. And the idea is that then we apply some sort of remediation strategies in order to get the student, get the learner to where we want them to be. So there are parallels between education, but there is also education which employs technology, and traditional kind of autism interventions. And recently, maybe not so recently, I mean, this is a work which has been going on since at least 2003. There are alternative approaches to autism interventions which emphasize the need for the creation of the environment for children in order to bring out their strengths, in order for practitioners and for carers more broadly to understand the strengths of the children and to help them move away from this model of deficit in order to support the children's strengths and in order to actually motivate them to engage with the environment and engage in social communication. In fact, motivation is the lack of motivation to engage is often identified as the main reason why many of the autistic children do not communicate. Many of the nonverbal children, in particular, it's not that they can't communicate; it's that more to the point they don't want to communicate. So we took this, there is this lovely, probably some of you may be familiar with this framework, the SADS framework, which focuses on social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support, where this transactional support is a central kind of aspect of this model, and it puts the onus of responsibility for creating this environment in which the child can thrive on the practitioner and educator and carer. And so we took this model as an inspiration, and this idea of having to move away from the deficit model. And we spent quite a lot of time on this project called Echoes, where we developed the environment in which children could explore. So we tried to move away from the pure kind of drill and practice approach to an environment in which there would be quite a bit of scaffolding, but the scaffolding would be also enhanced through exploration and play. So we had a number of activities which were very goal-directed. They had very, very well-defined goals behind them, but there were also open-ended activities where children could simply fool around with the environment and explore without this kind of imposition of a particular end goal. One key things about this environment was that, unlike in many environments, we also incorporated the human practitioner in the environment. So there was no separation necessarily between the technology and the human support and the classroom content. So just to give you a little bit more of an idea of how this environment worked, we had an AI agent at the core. The idea here being that actually there was a lot of discussion around whether we needed an agent, embodied agent that looked a little bit like a human, and through a lot of discussions, but also through a lot of workshops and a lot of empirical work, we arrived at the conclusion that actually we do need to have this kind of agent that could provide social partnership to the child, that could draw in the child into the environment and provide indeed the stepping stone for communication. But we also had a human in the loop, a human who could pick up on aspects of the interaction that perhaps the agent was unable to pick up on. So one of the things that the agent couldn't do is to understand, for example, what the child was saying. The interaction was happening purely through touch. So the agent knew where the child's focus of attention was, and whether the actions were congruent with the particular activity, but they couldn't respond through by relying on the understanding of natural language, for example. These were technical limitations, but they were not game breakers, if you like. And then we also took into consideration the broader school and classroom environment, because we're very keen to see the transition. We wanted to see whether we could observe any kind of transition and transfer between the technology specific and human to human, so child to human interaction, and then broader context within which which child inhabited. And so that was the main kind of context and aspiration. It was the general setup of the environment, which actually stands in contrast to a lot of technology enhanced and AI enhanced applications where there is an assumption that basically the child or the learner interacts with the technology, and there is actually a clear separation between technology and the broader environment of the learner. In terms of the agent, I don't expect you to kind of go through this diagram, but just to give you an idea of how complex the agent was. It was really mimicking or trying to mimic a real person's behavior. And one of the key features of our agent was that it was furnished with an emotional kind of module. So the goals and the actions that the agent was had, and the actions that it selected, were also colored by its emotional predispositions, which we set. And these were set based on a series of quite intensive workshops with children, autistic children, but also with practitioners. And in this case, in the case of ECHOS, our agent was predominantly a very positive chap. So the children could actually interact and do all sorts of despicable things to this agent, and the agent would remain very, very cheerful. what it allowed us to do was to actually embellish the agent with seemingly human reactions. So these emotional states, these emotional abilities, we then translate it into facial expressions, into gestures, and it really provided a kind of a sense of presence that is needed in social interactions. And in this context, we also uh, obviously we tried to evaluate the system. And what we observed were quite interesting patterns, although for many engineers, some of these patterns would be considered a failure. So we looked in particular at whether there were any changes in the patterns in the context of echoes with respect to children's responses to bids for interaction, and changes in their patterns of initiations of bids for interaction with others. These two areas are basically areas which are considered particularly challenging in the context of autism. And what we did observe that we had obviously pre and post evaluation as well. And what we have observed that although we didn't observe transfer effects pre and post, we did see very interesting patterns of behaviors in relation to children's responses to agents versus to the agent versus humans. So we can see from the left-hand side that the proportion of the responses to agent kind of decrease, while the proportion of responses to humans increase. And this is actually a pattern which could be considered a failure by engineers, because obviously, in engineering, we are quite obsessed with getting our technology working. And so this may indicate that the children are losing interest in the agent. But from the point of view of education, actually, this is precisely what we were after. We were after initiating this motivation to communicate, but ultimately we were very interested in we were after the child actually interacting with you. In terms of the initiations, we have also very interesting results, because we have a consistent pattern of increasing initiations to both humans and the agent. Oh God, 5 minutes left. Indicating that there is something interesting is happening there as well. We had some very positive comments from the school as well. The environment had really quite an impact on a number of schools, and we have observed also quite a number of changes, although these are anecdotal, unfortunately, of transfer of particular behaviors to classrooms. So, for example, we had a number of children who were considered non-verbal, who actually did begin to communicate within the classroom context, which has not been observed for them previously. Moving on to the second example, I wanted to highlight the potential of technology as a way of tapping into the higher order thinking capacities and metacognitive abilities. We know that these are very important for learning. In fact, many consider these primary. We know that they are very important to the development of critical thinking and even moral kind of identity creation and morality. formation. And we also know we have increasing evidence also from neuroscience of how metacognitive ability develops. And not least, these metacognitive, these higher order thinking abilities are tightly linked to the observation that actually emotional self-regulation is critical to cognition, since emotion actually is overshadowing in many ways our reasoning. This is a very beautiful paper by Imordino, Yang, and Damasio, which I highly recommend, which talks about these issues. And here, very briefly, unfortunately, I'm running out of time. I want to highlight an opportunity within the AI in education research, which relates to use of open learner modeling, which if you're interested, there is a great paper by Susan Bull and Judy Kay, which I have put up here for your reference, which describes in detail how these models work. But in essence, they operate on the basis of using the models that an intelligent tutoring system or intelligent learning environment generates, and giving this data back, interpretation back to the learner. And you can use these models these open models in a variety of different ways. For example, to allow the students to inspect them, to discuss them with their peers or with their teachers, or even at the very kind of other end of the spectrum of how these models operate, to edit them and to argue with the technology itself as a way of generating self-explanation and self-understanding. And here is an example from another project. This was a European project called TARDIS, which actually developed a serious game, a coaching environment in which young people at risk of social exclusion through unemployment could practice and rehearse and develop social interaction skills, social communication skills necessary for engaging in job interviews. In this context, so this is basically the overview of the environment. It had a lot of complex technology behind it. But in essence, we have created artificial agents which acted as job recruiters, in which the young people were given the opportunity to rehearse their skills and also explore other agents' reactions in real time. But the key feature of this environment was an open learner model. It was an inspectable model, which means that it could only be viewed rather than interacted with, which provided learners and practitioners with a trace of the interactions with interpretations of specific behaviors of importance to job interviews. So, for example, information about the energy in the voice, about the interpretation of the emotional state of the learner, which then provides an opportunity for discussion, very concrete discussion with practitioners. And again, we went on to evaluate this system. And one of the key things that we observed was that we had a controlled study which involved a TARDIS condition and another environment which is kind of typically used in these kinds of contexts. And what we did find was that actually there was a marked and significant improvement in self-perception by the students of themselves in terms of how anxious they felt, how self-efficacious they felt, and also how well they performed on specific interviews. So that was very encouraging. But also we did an analysis of particular kinds of behaviors, for example, with respect to the quality of the answers, and we observed some really positive trends, and in many cases significant differences pre and post, and also between the conditions, in terms of how well the students responded to particular questions, as well as specific nonverbal behaviors such as improvements in eye contact, tone of voice, and facial expressions, which we attribute very much to this combination of situated rehearsal followed with very concrete and detailed inspection of the interactions and in having the interpretations also provided by AI to provide the kind of scaffolding for the self-reflection. So this is an example of AI as a mirror, which I think is a particular area for development in this context. And it also taps in, going back to the framework, it also taps into this importance of explainability of AI as a technology, as a technology that is used within education. It also provided this approach also provided practitioners with an opportunity to discuss their own practices and interpretations of what the students are doing. And one of the surprising things that we found in our studies and discussions also with the practitioners is how much disagreement there exists between them. So in that sense, technology used in this way can also provide a very strong pair of glasses for the practitioners themselves. Transparency. I'm almost done.
Thank you.
I am really done. So, before I conclude, I just wanted to make this point very, which I think is a very important point to make. Whenever we talk about AI, we are really in danger of being seduced by the allure of the term and all of the kind of rhetoric and discussions and the fantasies that are being brought about in those discussions. This is very cognate to what is known in neuroscience as the seductive allure of neuroscience. So basically the idea of, and this is actually very well documented through rigorous research, that the moment you put a picture of a brain on a slide or in a paper, people kind of bow down to it and believe whatever is being said. So we have to be, there is a similar kind of issue with AI where we really do need to be aware of the seductive allure of artificial intelligence and also the seductive allure of data. Having said this, there are many opportunities, and I will conclude with a couple of questions. Can we use our growing understanding of the challenges and opportunities offered by AI technology to rethink education more broadly? And I think, yes. And we really, these examples that I have given, I really strongly believe illustrate how we can actually think outside of the box of well-established practices. Self-regulation, social communication, and metacognition are really important areas for AI development and application, where we already have actually existing approaches that we can utilize straight away in education. And then the second question is, how can AI-enhanced technology for education coexist, co-support, and co-evolve with our growing aspirations? But also, what kind of knowledge we can generate about what doesn't work. And in order to do this, we need more than knowledge-based systems, more than statistical classifiers. We need to think hard about those aspects of AI that make it an agent in the teaching and learning process and its relative strengths. And we also need educators' involvement right from the start. Thank you.